Chapter 11. The president is calling. She starts out talking about, it's a dumb title. She starts out talking about her father's respect for President Obama and plays part of the concession speech and, you know, his support of him, and then sort of uses that as a contrast to the current lack of bipartisanship support in the current political climate. The fact that Trump at one point called her, she tells this story, to say that, you know, something that he said about her dad was misconstrued, and, you know, he likes her dad and he likes her, and Melania got on the phone, and it was a dumb little story. I don't know why it's the title of this chapter, because really what she's doing in this chapter is just, you know, stating the obvious, that there's a lack of work on both to, you know, cross the aisle from either party. And she talks about, you know, everyday Republicans, that she goes on the show. She must have written this when she was still on the program, because it, you know, it even talks about how the media is going to treat President Biden after he's inaugurated. So it's clearly written a while ago. But she says she goes on the show every day to try to represent, you know, conservative voices that don't get to be heard on mainstream media. But it's difficult for her because she's part of the dreaded 1%. Yeah, you don't really fully understand what, you know, she makes an example of the, you know, everyday Americans who voted for Trump, you know, have living paycheck to paycheck, have trouble putting food on the table. What she doesn't point out is that what the Democrats actually propose in terms of legislation would help those people. And what the Republicans do with legislation is hurt those people. So, you know, you can't try to say you represent these people when none of the policies actually do anything to help the situation that they're in. So she says at one point that she doesn't know, she knows of conservatives who read the New York Times, but she doesn't know of any liberals that read conservative or listen to conservative media, in which she also name drops the Federalist. Meghan, we don't read that shit because it's shit. It's lies. It's propaganda bullshit. We don't need to read it. The New York fucking Times isn't that great. It's not liberal. It constantly has, oh, let's talk about how a Trump voter feels about this. It's constantly Republican apologizing. So this whole idea that there's a liberal media is also just a Republican, you know, bugaboo. She says that, you know, the partisanship of everyday people never used to matter so much. And she says, if you ask a Republican, they'll say the Democrats are all socialist elitists. And if you ask a Democrat, they'll say the Republicans are all white supremacists. There's a little bit of truth in there. But and then she goes on to say that, you know, the reason that we're in this situation is because our systems have broken down. And then she talks about how voting has become a political act, which it's always been a political act. That's the whole point. Your voting is you're joining the political process. It quickly devolved into our voting process has become so political that political analysts can no longer figure out how people are going to vote. It's not about political analysis, Meghan. It's about people. And she says it goes back to, you know, she used to call herself an independent. She was, she didn't like George Bush and Karl Rove. She didn't like the way they treated her family. And she thought that Karl Rove specifically was too divisive. And she blames those tactics for where we are now with Trumpism. But you got to go back a little further, Meghan. If you look at the policies of Ronald Reagan, starting with the economic policy and flipping our entire economy so that it fed the top to trickle down, which, as we know, 40 years later has failed, never trickled. You got billionaires going up into space and people that can't eat, working for them. So starting with the economic policy, but they really started the socialization of demonizing everybody else. And that's how they started this cult. Their policies were about stripping out education, about stripping out healthcare, about blaming the lack of jobs on immigrants or, the liberals, or, sending them off to China. A lot of those jobs disappeared because of automation, not because those jobs exist somewhere else. They just don't exist anymore. But the Republican sort of, overarching theme over the last 40 years has been keep them dumb, keep them sick, and keep them poor, blame everybody else, and tell them that you're the only one that can fix it. And they fall for it over and over and over again. But the Republicans never fix it. Things don't ever get better. They're lying, just flat out lying about what they're going to do for people. And then when they get in power, actually don't do anything except help wealthy people. That's pretty much it. And enact laws that actually hurt already marginalized people. So it's just bullshit that this is an ideological difference. And the idea, she's really frustrated that people are so polarized on these on their political identification. And it's because the Republicans have finally gone too far. They politicized public health and safety. So that becomes personal for everyone. We don't believe in this virus. We're not wearing a mask. We're not telling you a mandate. We don't give a shit if you die. Yeah, that's going to raise some temperatures in the room. So it's not that, the Democrats have gone too far left and we're too radical. It's that the Republicans lost their fucking minds as a constituency. And no, all 74 million people who voted for Trump are probably not racists, but they supported a racist, which says something, that they were willing to say it's okay to be racist. And you can't deny that that's not true. That's what you're doing by voting for him. And she goes on, launches on this whole thing about the squad and how, outside of hating Trump, the Democrats are fractured, which is not necessarily untrue, but it's not that we're fractured. I think that, and she calls AOC, radical, which she's not. The policies that are considered the progressive left are standard, fairly centrist policies that the vast majority of the people want. They refuse to admit that they want what AOC is proposing or the squad because they're told to hate the squad and everything that they represent. But they want things like greener jobs, access to healthcare, access to childcare, gun reform. These are things that are popular among the American electorate. The problem is they've been brainwashed by the right-wing propaganda machine for 40 years to hate anything relating to Democrats. That's the issue, Meghan. And you're unwilling to see it. You still have these glasses on that you somehow think the Republican Party is going to come back to what your father thought it was. And we already discussed this. It's not. She ends this chapter by saying, Trump's gone. What's next? Trump's not gone, you dum-dum. What's next is Trump 2.0, unless the Democrats work our asses off to maintain and gain majority in the House and the Senate so that we can actually pass a fucking bill without needing Manchin and Sinema, who are just compromise to all hell, and Republicans in disguise.